Hello everyone, welcome to another online class. Today let's begin with a quote. We are always slow in admitting great changes of which we do not see the steps. The mind cannot possibly grasp the full meaning of the term of even a million years. Charles Darwin. Today we'll have a discussion on the origin of species by Charles Darwin, 1859. This is a path-breaking work, and in the Victorian, as far as the Victorian England was concerned, it was something like an earth-shattering kind of a work. It challenged and it questioned and it rejected many assumptions that Victorian society was feeling proud of. So we'll have a discussion on this particular book, not the whole book. We'll pay specific attention to the last chapter of the work, which is titled Recapitulation and Conclusion. Myself, Arun Kumar CS. I teach English at Government College, Manadwadi. About the author and scientist Charles Robert Darwin. He was born in 1809 in England. His father Robert Darwin was a physician and his grandfather Erasmus Darwin was a botanist. So we can see the amount of scientific temper they had in their family, and also they were a group of free thinking people, and they stood firmly for abolition of slavery. So he had from the family background itself, he had an opportunity to think freely and to challenge the conventional modes of thinking. He joined University of Edinburgh Medical School to pursue his studies to becoming a physician, but he felt it too dull and uninspiring. So instead he was studying taxidermy, and also he joined what was called the Plinian Society. It was a group of students who were too much into natural history and shooting and beetle collection, and there was like that. So because he discontinued his studies at Edinburgh Medical School, he was sent to Christ's College, Cambridge, for a bachelor degree in arts, but he was disqualified there also. So he joined another degree, which was called an ordinary degree, and he passed it. But even then he was very much interested in natural history, natural theology, geology, botany, taxidermy, taxonomy, scientific endeavors like that. We'll discuss the rest of the story a bit later. The most important works of Charles Darwin are the Voyage of the Beagle, which came out in 1839. So this is basically, it was initially titled Journals and Remarks. This is something like a briefing of his trip on HMS Beagle. Origin of Species, 1859, is considered to be his magnum opus. And after that, Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex. In Origin of Species, he does not say anything about the origin and evolution of man. So it is in the second work, Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex, that he speaks in volumes about the evolution of man. After graduation, he continued staying at Cambridge, studying many works. He had so many influences. One of the main influences that he had was William Paley. William Paley's works on natural theology. As to what natural theology is, we'll discuss a bit later. And other influences on Darwin at that point of time was, another influence was John Herschel, that was natural philosophy. Alexander von Humboldt was another influence. He was a mathematician, and he was an explorer. And he also joined a course on geology by Adam Sedgwick. Now, Adam Sedgwick was one of the mentors of Darwin, and another mentor of Darwin was Henslow. he was his botany professor, former botany professor, and Henslow invited Darwin into an expedition to the South American islands with Captain Robert Fitzroy. This trip was not a scientific endeavor. This was originally a hydrographic project, which means the colonial powers at that time, they had their special interests in the rest of the world, and they used to conduct expeditions, very long expeditions, in order to study and survey and map the rest of the world, other unknown and distant, faraway places on the earth. So this was such an expedition, and Darwin was invited into it as a gentleman naturalist. And the voyage, and he had strong objections from his family, especially from the part of his father, Robert Darwin. And Robert Darwin did not want his son to go on such a long expedition, but Darwin was determined, and finally Robert Darwin had to agree with the plan. So the voyage started in December 1831, and they started from Plymouth, England, and they proceeded through Cape Verde. Cape Verde is a very small group of islands on the western coast of Africa near Morocco, and they went on to Brazil and Patagonia. Patagonia is the southernmost country in South America, and they proceeded along the western coast of South America to the famous Galapagos Islands, where Darwin conducted extensive study, and he traveled into the land, and he observed the famous birds, which were later called Darwin's finches. And they went on to Australia and South Africa, and they came back after almost 5 years after, in October 1836. During the journey, he spent extensive time on land, observing the soil, plants and animals. So especially in places like Galapagos Islands and also in Patagonia, he traveled far into the land. He went in on top of the mountains, and he studied the soil structure. So as I already said, he was very much interested in geology also. So he observed different kinds of birds and collected specimens, and also simultaneously he was sending notes and specimens to England as well. These observations would later come to know as the theory of natural selection. This is a route map of HMS Beagle. We can see that they started their journey in Plymouth, and they went on to South America, and they proceeded westward into the Pacific Ocean to Australia, and where they studied coral reefs, and next they went to South Africa, and again to some areas in South America, and they returned to England. Now, what were the influences on Charles Darwin? He had so many influences, some of which, the most important ones, are these. One is natural theology. What is natural theology? Natural theology is not, from today's point of view, it is not a science, but it was something like a scientific endeavor, but it was a form of theology. Fundamentally, it was a form of theology, and the main proponent of which was William Paley. And one of the main works of William Paley was titled Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, 1802. So natural theology is a form of theology which had the belief that the natural phenomena, various natural phenomena, plants, animals and their coexistence, their struggle and their survival, all these natural phenomena, we can take them as evidences to the existence of God. So the more you study nature, the more you are convinced of the existence of God. This is the underlying principle of natural theology. So in natural theology, there is something called watchmaker's analogy. Watchmaker's analogy, watch is a design. So watchmaker's analogy means whenever there is a design, the watch, the nature, the plants, the human body, the animals, the structure of the universe, all these are designs, just like a watch. So whenever there is a watch, there is a watchmaker as well. So whenever there is a design, there should be a designer. So the existence of a design, the world, the universe, the cosmos, the plants, the animals, the biosphere, this is again a proof that a designer exists, God exists. So this was natural theology. And again, natural philosophy. John Herschel was the main proponent, one of the main proponents of natural philosophy. Natural philosophy it was somewhat like a scientific endeavor. This was a crude form of natural science, natural philosophy. Later it became what we call today natural science. So natural philosophy is a philosophical study of nature. Basically it was a philosophical study of, it was a study of nature, but not strictly scientific as far as today's yardsticks are concerned. Another most important influence was geology, especially Charles Lyell. And Charles Lyell had a important work, Principles of Geology. It was published in 3 volumes between 1830 and 33, in which Charles Lyell presents a very interesting argument, which he calls uniformitarianism, which means uniformitarianism was viewed in opposition with catastrophism. So what is uniformitarianism? First of all, Lyell proposed that the earth was much older than they had thought about the age of earth during the Victorian times. So the age of the earth or the universe, so all these things were a matter of scientific endeavor, as well as it was a matter of religious belief also, because various religious scriptures, they had their own opinions and references about the origin of the earth. So Lyell proposed that whatever geological laws are existing today or then during the Victorian times, such laws played a very crucial part in the formation of the earth, which means the formation of the earth did not occur all of a sudden. It was not something like a catastrophe. It was not a sudden event. It formed very slowly, very gradually, because as they could observe the geological processes, various phenomena were very slow and very gradual. So these laws were precisely acting upon the formation of earth from the beginning of time. So from if you take it from that point of view, the earth was much older, much older than they had thought about it. Catastrophism, for example, Noah's flood, prescribed in the biblical texts, it is a catastrophe. It is a geological event occurring as a catastrophe, a sudden and unplanned, that kind of a thing. So Lyell stated that uniformitarianism was the fundamental principle, as well as geological occurrences and also the formation of the earth was concerned. Another influence on Darwin was taxidermy. Taxidermy was the art of stuffing animals for display. He was taught this art by somebody called John Edmondstone. He was not a scientist. He was a freed slave. And another branch of science was taxonomy. Taxonomy is naming, the practice of naming and classification of plants and animals into different kingdom, phyla and group, family, and finally genus and species. Then another was beetle collection. Darwin was very much into beetle collection when he was at Cambridge, and he published an article on it titled Illustrations of British Entomology. Another very famous influence on, very important influence on Charles Darwin was Thomas Robert Malthus. And Malthus had written a book titled An Essay on the Principle of Population in 1798. What was the importance of this work on Darwin? Malthus proposed that as far as the population of the earth or a particular community was concerned, it had a tendency to double the population in every 25 years, or the population increase was according to a geometrical ratio. So there needs to be an increase, a substantial increase or a doubling of the population over a certain period of time. So this proposition made a very significant impact on the observations of Charles Darwin, because Darwin could see that the organisms had a tendency to increase their population or double their population in a certain period of time. That was not happening actually. So his thoughts were on why this was not happening in reality. Then there was another scientist whose name was Auguste de Candolle. Auguste de Candolle, he was a botanist, and his idea was nature's war. He proposed that various different organisms of the same species and different species, organisms of different species, all of them, they war, which he called the warring of species. They had a struggle, they had a clash. In the course of their growth and in the course of their attempt to survive, organisms or species had a clash. So this played a crucial role in what was later called the struggle for existence. About the work on the origin of species, the complete title of the work is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in Struggle for Life. It was published in November 1859. In the midst of, Darwin was facing so many personal tragedies at that point of time. His own health was going very weak, and his daughter was also ill. He had so many problems. He was not living in London, he was living elsewhere. So he was in the midst of so many personal problems, and he managed to get it published in November 1859. Originally it had 14 chapters, and the last chapter is titled Recapitulation and Conclusion, which we'll pay a bit more attention today. And the book was intended for non-expert public as well, but it is not an easy read. So although it is not as very scientific, strictly it is a scientific work, but it is not exclusively for scientists. It was also meant for public, but it's not an easy read. Darwin was not a very what do we call, very easy kind of a writer to read. The language and the style demands steady concentration to follow the train of thought. So he used long sentences. In the midst of, we could find examples, and he going back to the previous point. So the prose style of Darwin is not in favor of the reader. And the idea of natural selection, will get back to the last chapter in a little while, but before that, let's understand what natural selection is. Most of us might be familiar with this idea, and almost all of us might know it already, but still, for the sake of clarity, let's be clear about it. What is natural selection? As Darwin explains, natural selection is a process whereby organisms that are better adapted to their environments in a struggle for existence survive. so which he calls the survival of the fittest. So who survives? Not every organism of a particular community survive. That does not happen in nature. Only some of them survive. Who survive? Those who are successful in maintaining favorable variations and also successful adaptations to the changing environments. Only they survive. So in this process of survival, there is a clash between these organisms, which he calls the struggle for existence. Clash does not mean the physical fights or a violent clash. We should not understand it in that sense, but there is a struggle, there is a competition between different organisms in a particular community. Natural selection, Darwin's proposition was not just this. Natural selection was the chief agent of evolution. This is the underlining finding of Charles Darwin. Species evolve, new species evolve. How do they evolve? They evolve through natural selection. Organisms acquire variations or modifications from their parents in order to adapt and survive better. Favorable modifications would prevail and unfavorable modifications would disappear. This is responsible for the formation of varieties. So the proposition of Darwin is that from an existing species, as per the changing environment, the different organisms, plants, be it plants or animals, they acquire modifications, and successful modifications, favorable modifications, modifications that would help the organism to survive. Such modifications would remain and they are transferred to the next generation, and this is how varieties are formed. So the next generation or some generations afterwards, such plants or animals would be different and they are called varieties. And the formation of varieties, when that happens over a long period of time here means unimaginably long period of time, thousands or lakhs of years. When that happens over such long periods of time, new species evolve. Now about the final chapter, recapitulation and conclusion. What does he say? How does he conclude his magnum opus in the final chapter? Let's see. He begins with 3 propositions that help us understand natural selection. In the very beginning itself, in the very beginning of the final chapter itself, Darwin makes it very clear that it is very difficult to understand natural selection, and also it is very difficult to accept such an unconventional idea. But these 3 propositions would help us understand natural selection. One is individual difference. Individual difference, as we know, is the difference that each and every organism has from their parents or from their ancestors. This is individual difference. So individual difference are according to the changing environments. This is individual difference is something that an organism is bound to have. They would definitely be different from their parents, and this is among these differences, favorable ones would be transferred to the next generation. And there is a struggle for existence. So a struggle for existence is to survive by maintaining profitable or beneficial variations. And there is gradation as well. In the course of evolution, there is gradation. So he explains gradation with the help of various kinds of examples. But one such famous example would be the length of the beak of Darwin finches, which he observed in Galapagos Islands. So when he observed finches, he found that the length of the beak of different varieties of finches are different. So there is a gradation. either from becoming a very small beak to when going to a longer beak, there are various stages in the midst of. So evolution does not happen all of a sudden. So there are intermediate stages which he calls gradation. And also the Darwin anticipates the objections to his theory of natural selection. One such possible objection would be sterility. That is, if Darwin's claim is that all organisms, whether plants and animals, their attempt is to survive, their attempt is to reproduce, and their attempt is to pass their genes. Darwin does not use the word genes because genetics was not this much developed at that point of time, but he uses the idea of transferring the profitable variations to the next generation. If that is the aim, then how can one explain sterility? Some organisms are sterile, they are incapable of producing the offspring, the children. So Darwin explains that sterility is incidental. You cannot explain it, or you cannot use it as a very strong argument against this idea of natural selection. So he says sterility is incidental because of various factors. You cannot find a pattern about it, and it is not a counter argument against natural selection. And he says that when a particular organism is exposed to slight changes, climatic changes, other environmental changes, slight changes, favorable qualities are maintained. And when they are exposed to great changes, what happens? They perish. So whatever happens in nature, they happen very slowly, very gradually, over a long period of time. This is the tendency of nature. Now when unexpected and sudden changes occur, these variations, modifications, or the organism, they perish. Also he says that when the same conditions continue, means as far as a plant is concerned, his environment stays the same, or as far as his animal is concerned, his surrounding and his opportunities and his challenges, they all stay the same for a long period of time, or long period of time for a particular generation of a particular organism. Even then the good qualities perish. So the whole idea, or the key, is change. So change is what triggers variations, and variations results in varieties, and these varieties would result in the formation of new species. And he also speaks about geographical distribution. All the varieties of plants and animals, we can find them in many parts of the earth. So plants and animals are distributed all over the earth. Interestingly, we can find varieties of plants. For example, plants, when we take a plant from one part of the world, we can find similar varieties of the same plant in completely distant and different part of world. Now how can we explain it? How can the varieties of the same plant can be found in different parts of the world? This was a possible question. Now Darwin explains it as like this. All varieties, whether it be plants or animals, he says that plants and animals have a common parent. So all varieties of the same species and all species of the same genus, they have a common parent. Now what was responsible for their geographical distribution all over the world is migration. Migration, whether it be plants or animals, they might have migrated across the world. So this happened a long time ago, lakhs of years ago. Animals and plants, they started migrating, plants started migrating means they started getting distributed through different agents, animals, winds, and other climatic agents. So this migration took a very long time, thousands of or lakhs of years of time, and in the middle of this course of migration, intermediate species might have formed, but they might have formed and they might have perished. We cannot possibly know anything about them because there is a limitation of geological evidences. And he says very confidently, he says that conclusive evidences of this migration, that is their distribution, gradation, geological records are not available, or they may not be available ever, but still the theory of natural selection still stands. And another particular special context was domestication. What happens when certain animals or plants are domesticated? And Darwin says as man is an agent of change. Here what is called natural is broken up and there is an intervention of man. He settles down, he makes a home and he domesticates certain animals. So here man is an agent of change. He chooses those with slight variations and they become varieties of natural species. Such varieties, they are passed on to the next generation, and this variability is inherited indefinitely. And Darwin says when this variability continues, new species will definitely emerge. Then about the struggle for existence, let's understand it a bit better. Why should there be a struggle in the first place? There should be a struggle because there is increased number. So this is where his influence by Malthus, the population studies of Malthus, we can see. So there is a struggle due to increased number. Nature always produces more number of organisms than natural resources can sustain or protect. The food supply, the supply of minerals and other resources. So there is more number of organisms, whether be plants or animals. So there is a struggle between them in order to survive. For example, Darwin says there is a struggle among, if you look at the animal kingdom, we can observe it very clearly. There is a struggle among the males of a particular organism, particular species, for females, for the partners, for mating. So those who struggle and those who succeed will leave more progeny. So what is the instinct of organisms? The instinct is to leave more progeny, more offspring. Now there is a struggle for that, and all the male members, they participate the struggle, and those who succeed will get the opportunity to mate with the female partner and he will leave more progeny. Now how does a particular organism succeed? What determines success? Success is determined by two factors: adaptability and variability. As per the changing conditions, one need to adapt to such conditions, and also one need to acquire variations in order to adapt. And these adaptability and variability, these variations result in what we call varieties, and from varieties new species evolve. Then about natural selection, he says natural selection disproves the theory of creation. So in the course of his writing, whenever he tries to make a point, he very confidently, Charles Darwin, opposes and questions the theory of creation, which is which is the basic idea that the whole universe and the organisms, man, everything was created by God. The theory of creation was a foundational principle in the Victorian England, but then Darwin challenges it in Origin of Species, in every line of Origin of Species, because whenever he tries to make a point, he says that the theory of creation cannot explain this. The theory of creation cannot explain the geographical distribution of species. The theory of creation cannot explain the formation of new species, evolution of new species. So he says that natural selection replaces and disproves the theory of creation. And he says, he quotes this idea that natura non facit saltum means nature. The verbal meaning of the phrase is, it's a Latin phrase. The meaning is nature does not leap, means nature does not make changes, very sudden changes. Only slow things happen in nature. So Darwin says slight, successive and favorable variations accumulate. This is how he puts it. Slight, successive and favorable variations accumulate. And he points out many examples. Some examples would be woodpeckers prey on worms on ground. So why should woodpeckers prey on worms on ground? He says woodpeckers were initially they used to prey, and now they don't have, they have other forms of life, but still the old habits still remain. And upland geese that never swim have webbed feet. So the idea is that the geese, once they used to swim, they used to live near water. Now they do not live near water, so they do not swim at all. They no longer swim, but even then they still remain that webbed feet. This is a proof that this particular variety is a kind of evolution from the previous variety, because there is an evidence of the change. And also he explains the concept of beauty. So the idea of beauty can be explained with natural selection. So the beauty, what we call the beautiful, such as the bright colors of birds and flowers, singing of birds, etc. These are all more chances. These ensure, these beautiful forms, beauteous forms, as Wordsworth may put it. So these beautiful forms, they make sure more chances of mating, attracting their partner, and also fertilization, more chances of fertilization. And also he is conscious of the fact that extinction happens in nature. Certain species become extinct at some point of time. This he explains as new forms, new forms evolve and they replace the old forms. This is how Charles Darwin explains extinction. But we also know that extinction happens as a part of man's interventions in nature. That is another thing. Then in oceanic islands, he gives an example of oceanic islands. The terrestrial plants and animals are not found there. In the islands, the terrestrial plants and animals are not found. But you can observe bats. Different kinds of terrestrial species of bats can be found in oceanic islands, which means they might have traveled somehow, and you cannot trace the details of that migration because of the lack of evidence or because of the limitations of geology. But that does not disprove the fact that the migration has happened. So he says the theory of evolution cannot explain this. The oceanic islands, you cannot find terrestrial trees or terrestrial plants, but you can find terrestrial birds like bats, varieties of terrestrial birds. And how can this happen? The theory of creation cannot explain this. And natural selection, taxonomy has a major role in the light of natural selection, because natural selection proposes a genealogical arrangement from a common parent. Different kinds of plants and animals, they evolve, and they bring out new varieties, and new varieties would bring out new species, and from new species, from existing species, new species of evolve. So there is a genealogical arrangement. For example, you can trace similarities. The number of, these are the examples given by Darwin in the final chapter. He says the number of bones in the hand of man and the wing of bat and the leg of horse are the same, which means all these three, the man, the horse, the bat, at some point of time they had a common ancestor. Also, he says that the number of vertebrae in giraffe and elephant are the same, which means they also had a common ancestor. And also, he observes similarity in the wings and legs of bats and jaws and legs of crabs. There is similarity. So these are all more proofs to indicate a common origin. And he underlines the fact that plants and animals have a common progenitor, a common origin, a common ancestor, which was again a very conventional idea, very hard to believe. But he explains this by observing their cell structure and also their reproductive method and the effect of poison upon plants and animals. With the help of all these things, he is very sure of the fact that plants and animals have a common progenitor. But he says that it is impossible to trace migrations. It is impossible to trace migration because what he calls migration happened a long time ago. So today or during the Victorian times, there are no traces of those migrations which might have happened lakhs of years ago. And natural selection, he says, it is not an exclusive means of evolution, but it is a chief one. And he says there are some underlying laws in nature. All the species and all the organisms of all species, they struggle and they thrive based on these laws. What are they? One, growth with reproduction. Every species has a tendency to grow, and every organism has a tendency to reproduce and also to inherit, such as to pass on what they have to the next generation. And also variability. Variability can be from direct and indirect methods. I mean, because of direct factors or indirect factors, variability can be seen, and also from use and disuse. Disuse means some organs of some species they don't have a role because of disuse. So that is again a variability. So this is happening. I mean, variability. Some over a long period of time, some organisms, they don't use a particular organ. Again, that is a variability. So, and all the organisms, they have a tendency to increase, and also there is a ratio of increase. As Malthus says the population is doubled in every 25 years, but Darwin says that there is a ratio of increase. And also, as we already said, there is a struggle for existence, and there is natural selection. Natural selection indicates divergence of character. Natural selection means variability, change from the parent generation as per the changing situations, and also pass it on to the next generation. And the next generation, what happens? Then the next generation is also is a changed one. They also acquire changes, variations and modifications. So there is always a divergence of character. And finally, extinction. Extinction, he says, is an act of new species replacing the old species. Also extinction is a less improved state Extinction happens when there is no more improvement, or there is no more variations and modifications, there is no more varieties, and there is no more evolution. That is when extinction happens. This is how he concludes with these underlying laws that happen in nature. He concludes the final chapter. He ends the chapter by saying, by contrasting the theory of creation and also the theory of natural selection, and he rejects the theory of creation, and he says about the theory of natural selection, he says, there is grandeur in this view of life. Endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Thank you.